JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot tucked away in the middle of Springfield, Ohio. It was one of those places that had been around for decades, maybe longer than some of the people inside had been alive. The neon sign out front flickered slightly, buzzing with a quiet hum, casting a red and blue glow onto the cracked pavement below. The parking lot was half full, mostly with pickup trucks and older sedans, the kind that had seen more miles than their owners cared to admit. As he shut off the engine, JD sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the weight of the day settle over him. It had been long, longer than most. Meetings, handshakes, policy discussions, and the same conversation he'd had 1,000 times before. The kind of day that made him crave something simple. A hot meal, a cup of coffee, and a moment to himself before the drive back. A local he'd spoken to earlier that afternoon had mentioned the place in passing, swearing by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. Best in the county, the man had told him, with an enthusiasm that suggested it was more than just a meal. It was a piece of home. JD had smiled, nodded, and made a mental note. Now, after the day he'd had, it seemed like the perfect choice. With a sigh, he pushed open the car door, the evening air cool against his skin. The faint scent of fried food and coffee lingered in the breeze, slipping through the crack of the diner's front door each time it swung open. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement, and reached for the handle. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The diner was small, but familiar in a way that all diners seemed to be. A long counter lined with stools stretched along one side, while booths with cracked vinyl seats ran along the windows. A wall near the register was covered with faded Polaroids, snapshots of customers and staff, taken over the years, some so old the edges had curled. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease, brewed coffee, and something faintly sweet. Maybe pie, fresh out of the oven. The hum of conversation filled the room, low and steady, blending with the soft clatter of silverware against plates. JD took a step forward, scanning the room. At first, everything felt normal, comfortable even. But then, something shifted. He caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile, polite, professional, until she recognized him. It was quick, barely a second, but JD noticed it. A flicker of hesitation, the kind that slipped through before a person had time to stop it. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and the warmth in her expression cooled. JD didn't react. He'd been in enough rooms, had enough conversations, to recognize the moment people made up their minds about him. His gaze swept the diner again, more carefully this time. A few customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in slightly, whispering something to the person across from him. Another, a woman in a flannel shirt, set down her coffee cup with a little too much force, her eyes narrowing just slightly before looking away. JD felt the shift, subtle but unmistakable. A quiet tension, settling into the air like a mist rolling in off the water. He wasn't naive. He understood places like this. He'd grown up in them, spent his childhood in diners just like this one, where people knew each other by name, where outsiders were noticed the second they walked through the door. But this was Ohio, his home, and yet standing there, he felt like a stranger. The hostess hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful, measured. Good evening," she said, her fingers gripping the notepad at her side. "Are you dining in or taking out?" JD let out a small, tired chuckle. Dining in, if that's all right. Another pause, too long for a simple question. The hostess glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. Her weight shifted slightly, as if debating something. Actually, she hesitated, then offered a tight smile. I need to check something real quick. Just one moment. Without another word, she disappeared through the swinging door that led to the kitchen. JD stood there, hands resting at his sides, his gaze sweeping the room once more. A few more heads had turned. A man at the counter shifted in his seat, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Someone near the window muttered something under their breath, too low for JD to catch. But the person sitting across from them nodded slightly, their expression unreadable. The diner was silent now, or at least it felt that way. The clatter of plates and silverware had dulled. The conversations now hushed, like the room itself was holding its breath. JD exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax his shoulders. He'd been here before. Not in this exact spot, not in this exact moment, but in rooms where the air had felt just as heavy, where the weight of perception hung thick, where he was seen but not necessarily welcomed. He could walk out. It would be easy, simpler even. Get back in his car, drive down the road, find another place, somewhere without the unspoken tension pressing in on him like a second skin. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled absently through his messages. If they wanted to stare, let them stare. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for a meal. The kitchen door swung open again, and the hostess reappeared. She walked toward him, slower this time, her expression unreadable. JD raised an eyebrow, waiting. She stopped a few feet away, shifting her weight again. I'm really sorry, she started, voice softer now, almost regretful. But I'm afraid we're full for the night. JD glanced around the diner. Several empty booths. 3 unoccupied stools at the counter. A half-cleaned table near the window, crumbs still scattered across the surface. He met her gaze again, his expression neutral. Full, he repeated, his tone light, but edged with something else. The hostess swallowed, nodding once. JD studied her for a moment, then exhaled softly. There were a dozen things he could say, a dozen ways he could respond. He could push back, challenge her, point out the empty seats, call out the lie for what it was. He could let frustration slip into his voice, let anger take root in his chest. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled, just a small curve of his lips, barely there. Got it, he said simply, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Appreciate it. He nodded once, a polite gesture, then turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The diner remained silent. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, the night air cool against his face. Behind him, through the window, he could still feel the weight of their eyes. But he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The seconds stretched. Behind the swinging kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too low to make out, but urgent enough that JD Vance knew something was being discussed. Something about him. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Wouldn't assume the worst. Maybe there was a policy he didn't know about. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe... The door swung open again. The hostess stepped back into view, her stride more certain this time. The hesitation from earlier was gone. Now she wasn't unsure. She wasn't debating. She had made up her mind. Or, JD thought, someone had made it up for her. She stopped just a few feet in front of him, her notepad still clutched at her side, though she didn't glance at it. She didn't need to. I'm sorry, sir, she said, her voice firmer now. We can't serve you tonight. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. The whole diner seemed to tighten around her words, pulling inward, like a rope cinching taut. The air shifted. The quiet that had been creeping in since JD first walked through the door deepened. The usual diner sounds were still there. The sizzle of the grill from the back, the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner, the occasional scrape of silverware against porcelain. But something felt different now. The sounds were subdued, as if muffled beneath the weight of the moment. JD said nothing. The words sat between them, thick and unmoving, the kind of statement that didn't need further explanation, the kind that spoke volumes in its simplicity. People were watching, not openly, not obviously, but they were. He could feel it. The way shoulders had shifted ever so slightly in his direction, the way a coffee cup had paused halfway to someone's lips, the way the low murmur of conversation had dulled into something heavier, like the entire room was waiting for his response. JD's gaze held the hostess's for a long moment. She wasn't hostile, not angry, just firm, like she was delivering a verdict, one she had no intention of reversing. His eyes flicked past her, toward the kitchen. Through the small pass-through window, he could see two cooks standing behind the counter. Both men, both older than the hostess. They weren't speaking, weren't moving. They stood, half hidden, behind a row of heat lamps, their faces unreadable, but their silence spoke for them. JD cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" The question hung in the air. The hostess didn't fidget this time, didn't hesitate. "It's just..." She exhaled, pressing her lips together briefly before finishing. "We'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy, no excuse about closing early, no logistical reason at all. Just that." JD let out a slow breath through his nose, his hands settling on his hips. He had been in his fair share of tense situations before. On debate stages, across interview desks, in rooms filled with people waiting for him to slip up. But there was something different about being turned away from a place as simple as a roadside diner. This wasn't a press conference. It wasn't politics. It was a meal, a moment of quiet. A place where, in theory, anyone should be able to sit down, order a plate of food, and be treated like nothing more or less than another customer. And yet, a small cough broke the silence. JD turned slightly, his gaze landing on an older man sitting near the counter. The guy looked like he'd been coming here for years, maybe decades. His blue work jacket was worn at the cuffs, the fabric thinning from use. His hands, large, rough, weathered from a lifetime of labor, rested on either side of his plate, the last scraps of his meal still sitting untouched. He shook his head, not at JD, not at the hostess, just to himself, like a man who had seen this kind of thing before. Then, without a word, he stabbed his fork into the last of his eggs, as if that settled it. JD's gaze shifted to a booth along the far wall. A woman sat there, probably in her mid-40s, her long-sleeved flannel rolled up at the elbows. She was watching him, but not with anger, not even with curiosity. Her expression was unreadable, carefully blank, like someone who knew it was best to stay out of things that didn't involve her. Across from her, a younger man, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, his flannel newer, cleaner, leaned back against the booth. His arms were crossed over his chest, and unlike the woman, he didn't try to hide his reaction. A smirk. Not a big one, not exaggerated, just the kind of expression that made it clear he was enjoying the show. JD let his gaze linger on him for a second longer before turning back to the hostess. She was still standing there, still waiting, but her fingers had tightened around the edges of her notepad. JD exhaled again, slower this time. He could fight this, he could press her, ask for a reason, Ask who told her to say it. Ask if she had an issue with him personally or if someone else had whispered in her ear the moment he walked through the door. Or he could leave. He could turn, walk out, get back in his car, and be halfway down the road before anyone in the diner even took another bite of their food. Both options sat before him, waiting. The diner waited with them. JD finally spoke, his voice calm. "You sure about that?" The hostess's throat bobbed as she swallowed. A pause. Then, "Yes." JD studied her for a moment longer. Then, finally, he nodded once. "All right. No anger, no frustration. Just two simple words." He turned. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he moved toward the door, the tension in the room stretching thin as wire. He reached for the handle. The bell above the door jingled again as he pushed it open, the cool evening air rushing to meet him. But before he stepped fully outside, he did something that no one in the diner expected. He stopped, just for a second. He didn't look back at the hostess, didn't glance at the man with the smirk, or the older man at the counter, or the cooks behind the kitchen window. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid a $20 bill onto the counter nearest the door. Then, without another word, he stepped outside. The door swung shut behind him, and inside the diner, for just a moment longer, the silence remained. The room had shifted. Not in the way a room does when someone leaves, when conversation picks up and things fall back into their natural rhythm. No, this shift was something else, something heavier. The air inside Owen's diner had thickened, like it had absorbed the weight of unspoken words, the kind people weren't sure they wanted to say out loud, the kind that sat in the back of their throats, held in place by hesitation, by habit, by something older than the moment itself. JD could feel it pressing down on him, the eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, measuring, calculating, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He had options. He could turn around, step outside, shake his head, and let it go. Pretend this didn't happen. Let it fade into the night like a bad memory. He could push back, demand an explanation, remind them who he was, and ask if they had any idea what this would look like in the morning news cycle. He could pull out his phone, take a picture of the door, type up a single sentence on social media, and watch the world react. He could challenge them outright, see if they'd stick to their decision when they realized they weren't just refusing a customer. They were refusing a U.S. senator. Instead, he did none of those things. He took a slow breath, let it settle in his chest, then exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said finally, nodding once. His voice was even, measured, no different than if he were asking for a refill on his coffee. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated. Her fingers tensed around her notepad, knuckles whitening for the briefest of moments, before she glanced toward the kitchen, as if asking for silent permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath, shaking his head like he'd already seen how this would end. Someone near the window let out a short, amused laugh, quick, breathy, like they couldn't believe JD was actually going through with this. JD just stood there, waiting. The hostess swallowed at once, then disappeared through a different door. The diner settled into an uneasy silence, a sip of coffee, a plate being slid across the counter, a fork scraping against ceramic, slow and deliberate. Then the door swung open. A man stepped out. Early 50s, broad-shouldered, thick arms, folded across a grease-stained apron. His build suggested he'd once been an athlete, football maybe, but time and hard work had reshaped him, softened the edges into something more solid, more immovable. His name tag read D-O-N. He wasn't wearing the kind of expression that welcomed conversation. Don didn't ask JD what he wanted. He didn't introduce himself, didn't extend the kind of fake politeness that some managers use to smooth over an uncomfortable situation. He just gave JD a once-over, his eyes moving up and down in a quick, assessing glance, and then said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it, low, flat, weighty, wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge, a thin kind of warning wrapped up in 5 simple words. JD met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to make a scene, to throw his weight around or demand some kind of forced apology. But he also wasn't about to just walk out of this place without understanding why. "Yeah," JD said. His voice was calm, level. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." A muscle in Don's jaw twitched. For the first time since stepping into the room, he glanced at the other customers. A quick flick of his eyes, like he was measuring the temperature of the room, checking to see just how much attention they were all paying. JD noticed it. And in that brief moment, something shifted. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the diner. This was about something bigger. Don rolled his shoulders back, unfolding his arms. "We don't gotta serve everyone," he said finally. JD studied him. "That right?" Don exhaled through his nose. "That's right." Silence settled between them again, thick and unmoving. JD could feel the weight of the entire room pressing in, the tension behind the counter, the curiosity from the booths, the quiet approval, the hesitant disapproval. But no one spoke. No one intervened. No one stopped this. JD tilted his head slightly, considering. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "All right," he said again. And with that, he stepped back. The movement felt final, like a decision had been made, even if no one had put it into words. He turned toward the door. This time, no one pretended not to watch him. He could feel their gazes following him as he crossed the floor. Heavy, weighted, some uncertain, some satisfied. JD reached for the door handle. The bell above it jingled softly as he pulled it open, the cool night air rushing in to meet him. He took one step outside. Then he stopped. Not for long, just long enough to reach into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp $20 bill. Without a word, he turned and set it down on the nearest empty table, just within reach of a half-finished cup of coffee. Then, without looking back, he stepped into the night. The door swung shut behind him, and inside the diner, for just a moment longer, the silence held.